On the 22nd of May 1960, a seismic event thought to be the greatest ever recorded, registering 9.5 on the monument magnitude scale, occurred near the city of Valdivia in South America. It became known as the Great Chilean Earthquake. Volcanoes erupted, landslides occurred, there were a number of gigantic aftershocks, and the resulting tsunami that hit the coast of Chile had waves of up to 25 metres high. That's equivalent to 5 double-decker buses stacked on top of each other. Nobody knows exactly how many people died, but it numbered in the thousands. The Lafkenche, coastal dwellers of the native Mapuche tribe, fled to the nearby hill to avoid the rising waves. But the waves followed them and did not recede. The American journalist Patrick Tierney spoke to a local Lafkenche who described the situation as follows, and I quote,
"The earth creaked and groaned, driving survivors out of their minds with fear. The ocean pulled back, stranding boats like toys, exposing miles of ocean bed and the refuse of centuries. There was an ominous silence. The ocean began boiling and roared inland."
As the volcanoes erupted and the aftershocks occurred, and the earth and seas refused to return to a normal quietude, a local shaman decided the only solution was a sacrifice to appease the angry gods. A 5-year-old boy whose mother was working away as a cleaner in a nearby city was chosen. The shaman and the grandfather of the boy took little Jose to the edge of the water. Then they cut off one of his arms and threw it in the sea. Then they hacked off the other arm and did likewise. They cut off the little boy's legs and also threw them in the sea. What was left of him they stuck like a stake in the sand. His mother reported that they threw her boy piece by piece into the ocean. Now, after being arrested for the crime, the perpetrators told the court that the boy was sacrificed, quote, to calm the earth and seas. Now, you might be wondering what the ritual execution of a young boy in Chile in 1960 has got to do with creative research practice. Well, let's find out.
If I was to pose to you the question, what is research? You would probably pause for reflection, and the direction of your thought would be towards the complexities of PhD study, or indeed postdoctoral practice in the universities of our nation and beyond. Now, although this direction would not be mistaken, I'd like to take a step or two back to the most elementary aspects of our lives and say that research is what we do as humans.
When a toddler sticks his finger in a honey pot and licks it, he's conducting research. He's investigating the world and learning something about the world, in this case, that it tastes good.
Likewise, if another toddler sticks her finger in a bee's nest or a cowpat, she is also conducting research, though the lesson she learns is a different one.
And when we play and hold a bat in a new way before hitting, or a ball in a different way before throwing, or a rope with a different grip before skipping, or indeed twist our friend's arm and hear them howl in pain, or wipe the tears from their eyes and see their sobbing stop, we are conducting research.
We are exploring and experimenting with possible ways of interacting with the world and with the people around us, seeing how objects and people react, and acquiring both knowledge and empathy. So our most elementary explorations of the world, of the realities we are born into and that surround us, is research. Research is how we learn. It's what we do as humans. For as human beings, we are naturally curious and naturally creative. We explore the world, we investigate the world through our senses, sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, through our bodies, but bodies connected to curious minds. And we learn about the world, we make interpretations of the world, and we draw conclusions about that world. That's all research is. It's what we do as humans.
And before we get onto the nature of creative practice and university-based research, I'd just like to take another step back and look at the way human beings and human societies explore, investigate, interpret, and draw conclusions about the world and how they act upon those conclusions.
So, if we take a natural event that affects human life and human society, this could be a geological or meteorological phenomenon like an earthquake or a hurricane. It might be a microbiological or virological phenomenon such as an incidence of a virus and its epidemiological consequences in its spread throughout the population. Then how do different societies make sense of these? So, in what I'd call primitive, superstitious or religious societies, events such as earthquakes or droughts, crop failures, plagues and famines are interpreted as signs that the gods are angry. And the ideological framework of society, the belief system, is not just some theoretical hermeneutic coda. It has real consequences for real people. If the gods are angry, then it must be because the people have sinned. So the logical reaction is to punish the people, or perhaps to sacrifice some prisoners, or virgins, children, whomever, to expiate that anger, as they did in primitive religious societies. There are examples of ritual killings across the ancient world, including poisonings, drownings, stabbings, hangings, impalements, dismemberments, decapitations, immolations, and vivisepulture, amongst others.
Or in the medieval period, when the plague or pestilence as it was known was ravaging North Africa and Europe, Muslim scholars approached it as a merciful martyrdom from God, an honour for believers that secured a place in paradise. So hence there was no point in trying to seek medical treatments to prevent it. Indeed, such attempts could be viewed as blasphemous.
And the medieval Christians dealt with the Black Death in a similar way, in their case by self-flagellation, whipping themselves as punishment for their sins, along with the usual bloodletting and massacres of the Jews, lepers and other unto mention. Needless to say, none of this helped prevent or cure the plague. And these, what we think of now as stupid superstitious responses, are unfortunately not a purely ancient or indeed medieval phenomenon. I mentioned the poor little boy who was ritually sacrificed in 1960 to expiate the sea god after the Valdivia earthquake in Chile. And there have been 21st century cases of human sacrifice in India, in Africa and in Europe. So primitive, religious and superstitious societies tended and tend to make sense of these natural events in ways that had and have catastrophic effects for many ordinary people.
So let's move on to scientific research. For fortunately, most of us no longer live under the anti-human horrors of theocratic regimes, but live in societies in which science, with its evidence-based procedures, dictates, at least to some extent, our relation to the kind of catastrophic events that I've described.
And this brings us to the university and to traditional academic research. How would scientists deal with a viral outbreak such as the plague or the more contemporary COVID-19 outbreak? Well, chemists and microbiologists would analyse the cell structure of the virus and how it interacts, bonds with and affects the cells in the human body. Virologists would isolate and culture the virus, classifying it and providing information about disease causality and resistance with a view to vaccine development. Epidemiologists are primarily interested in the spread of the disease and the risk factors and implications for the general population. Their findings will inform public health policy. And this is where what we might think of as hard science spills over into social science, economics, politics, sociology and so forth. For sociologists are likely to be interested in how the virus impacts different social groups, middle and working class, professional or manual workers, men as opposed to women, white versus farm groups, rich and poor. Their research would likely offer answers to questions as to why, for example, working class men have higher death rates from the disease than middle class professional workers, and this would draw attention to inequalities in our society. Economists will offer insights on the effects of lockdown on the economy, advise the government on how they might support or re-employ the growing number of unemployed, and estimate the cost of different proposed solutions. Political scientists might look at government policy and might compare infection and death rates across countries that follow different paths to deal with the infection. This research might show which public health policies were more successful than others, and they might be able to offer explanations of, say, why the US and UK have higher death rates than Korea and China, and point to political ideologies, political pressures, political actors, and political decisions that led to deadly outcomes for the population. And this is where the social sciences blend into the humanities, into law, human geography, philosophy, and history. Historians, for example, might draw comparisons with the Great Spanish Flu of 1918, which spread across the world and killed 20 million people or more. Or they might look at the much more contemporary history of the NHS and the trajectory of privatisation, from Thatcher's NHS review in 1988, Blair's PFI initiatives in the late 90s, to the Cameron government's 2012 Health and Social Care Act, which had a specific privatising agenda. And they could examine the consequences of this, such as Richard Branson's Virgin Care, which sued the NHS for $2 million when they were not awarded a contract, to the 2016 exercise Cygnus, which forewarned the Conservative government that action was needed on pandemics, that there were not the necessary number of ventilators, stockpiles of PPE, ICU beds, and so forth. But because the action needed would have reversed the privatising agenda, it was ignored. The results of this inaction and privatising agenda can be seen in the mortuaries, crematoria, and graveyards of Britain today. Which perhaps brings us to our own agenda and discipline within the humanities, which takes an unusual approach for the Academy in that it is not simply an investigation of the documentary evidence or application of theory, but rather it's creative writing activity, that is, creative practice as research.
History, no matter how well documented and evidenced, only offers us a limited understanding. The novelist Anthony Burgess once said, and I paraphrase from memory, that it was only after reading J.G. Ballard's novel The Empire of the Sun that you could fully understand what the Japanese war in China was like, how it was experienced as a human being, as a subject of that violence. And similar eulogies were written about The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck's novel of the American Great Depression, which showed the effect of bank foreclosures on an ordinary family. So if we return to the COVID-19 pandemic, what can our discipline contribute? What is research in creative writing? We can say that it's through imaginative writing that we can explore those extraordinary effects of being in isolation, of what it feels like to miss your loved ones, or be that old lady living alone, forbidden visits from a family, or to be that frontline nurse as she makes her way onto the COVID ward for the first time, the smell of it, the sound of her footsteps, and the sound of the gasping of patients, or to be that gasping patient, fearing that each breath might be your last, or indeed the unconscious patient on a ventilation unit suffering terrifying drug nightmares of the coming reaper, or to be that care home worker confronted with her duties to the sick and vulnerable when she finds there's no more PPE. And as creative writers, we can explore how it feels to be the woman who lost her husband to the disease, or to be the man who couldn't hold the hand of his dying wife, or the daughter who couldn't bury her father. And this need not only be through prose, but could be through dramatic writing, through theatre plays and screenplays, or indeed we could write a collection of poems in a polyphony of voices: husband, mother, daughter, carer, patient, lover, funeral director, exploring the experience of the crisis through the medium of poetry, a poetry of the pandemic. For it's only when we experience and imaginatively project ourselves into the minds and hearts of others through our writing, through our creative representation of the crisis, do we begin to appreciate and understand it in its full human dimension. So this goes beyond science, vital as it is, beyond the graphs of global spread, beyond the pie charts of ethnographic proportions, beyond the data and historical facts, into how it feels to experience the crisis as a human subject, what it means for us as human beings. And this, in its essence, is research as creative practice. It's exploring, interpreting and making sense of the world through imaginative projection and representation, through empathy, by stepping into the shoes of others and seeing things from their point of view, how they experience the reality with which they are faced, through their senses, through their fears, their hearts and minds. And it's through this practice that we bring a greater understanding to the reality of COVID-19 or indeed any other phenomenon. And this is what literature does at its best, what creative writing does at its best, explore in all its dimension what it's like to be a human. But perhaps you're thinking this is all a little too grandiose, a little too Tolstoyan. If we step aside from the grand ambitions of the literary novel into the bastard offspring of literature, genre fiction, does this offer us anything of value in relation to the crisis? Can research as creative practice take place within this arena? What would it mean if we rewrite the crisis within the tropes of, say, a crime or horror story, or indeed science fiction or fantasy?
Well, if we think of the classic crime novel, then the whodunit springs to mind. In relation to the COVID crisis, then the whole host of crazy conspiracy theories could be explored. Was the virus man-made? Who manufactured it and why? Was it the wicked Chinese who invented it to destroy the economies of the West? Or indeed the evil empire of Uncle Sam, whose military joined the Wuhan Games just before the start of the crisis, including athletes linked to Fort Detrick, the American Army Germ Research and Biodefense Center? Or perhaps it could even be, God forbid, the good old British whodunit, whose notorious experiments with biogenetic warfare date back over 100 years. Which brings us on to horror, the classic genre for the exploration of fear. And what could be a better metaphor of the virus than the evil monster of horror fiction, an external, inhuman entity that is out there, unseen, and coming to get you? Perhaps still more interesting would be science fiction. What would, for example, society be like in a future in which the virus never goes away? A society in which perhaps more virulent and deadly strains of the virus appear? How would humans conduct themselves? What would it be like to live in a society in which you couldn't go within 2 meters of another human being? What would it be like to be unable to touch or be touched by anyone? How would humans breed? What would sex be like? And if we take an additional paranoid dystopian turn on this, what would the world be like? A world in which, just imagine, private corporations grow rich and powerful through developing and controlling access to a vaccine or to drugs which control the symptoms of the disease, and hence to which only the super rich have access. Would rich, powerful men purchase an underclass of poor young women for sexual pleasure and cast them off to die of the virus, whilst the professional class of medics monitor their masters to protect them from the disease? Or could we take a still more unusual twist from this dystopian future into a certain type of feminist utopia in which the virus has liberated women from the role of mother, wife and domestic worker, from their imprisonment as carriers of the womb, away from their role as primary producers of children, of the next generation of the workforce, and into some kind of postmodern, independent, burden-free utopia?
So, far-fetched or not, as some of these genre-based scenarios sound, is this still not creative research? Are we not exploring and interpreting certain elements of our reality, with the virus here functioning as plot device, expositionary context, or indeed infrastructural, physical or psychological setting, in which aspects of our society, capitalism, the might of corporations, the control of information by private companies, the power gap between rich and poor, the sexual relations of men and women, and other aspects of humanity can be explored.
Keats famously lamented that when scientists were able to explain the actual makeup of the rainbow through the physics of light refraction, the rainbow, in all its stunning aesthetic beauty, had somehow been stripped of its magic. But D.H. Lawrence, 100 years later, wrote a novel entitled The Rainbow, in which, whilst in no way denying or rejecting the science, the rainbow functioned in all its symbolic glory, with the promise and hope for humanity, not in Lawrence's case through a promise from God, but as a phenomenon of nature through the possibilities of relations between men and men, women and women, and men and women as natural human beings.
So indeed, could there be an eco-fiction of COVID-19? The virus existing as a natural phenomenon alongside which we must live or die, as we do with the mammals and birds and insects and sea life, within a self-regulating or indeed out of control biosphere? Well, creative practice is the way to find out. And this is what we mean by creative writing research. It's exploring a phenomenon by writing about it in its full human context and thereby answering fundamental questions on what it means to be human, on what it means to be alive.